Good afternoon. My name is Kouri Marshall, and I serve as the Director of State and Local Public Policy Central Region for the Chamber of Progress. Chamber of Progress is a tech industry association supporting public policies to build a more inclusive country in which all people benefit from technological leaps. Our partners include Google and Midjourney, but they never have a vote nor a veto on our positions. Chamber of Progress appreciates Senator Majority Leader Rodriguez's leadership on AI. We've met with him several times regarding SB 205, and we thank him for the many amendments he adopted. However, our concern remains that SB 205 would harm innovation in Colorado and undermine the equitable distribution of AI's benefits across the state. AI tools have incredible potential to transform healthcare, education, and the industry at large. To take one example, teachers are already utilizing AI to make our nation's rich history come alive in the classroom, so school kids can talk with and learn from digital likenesses of our nation's founders to better understand our journey towards a more perfect union. SB 205 stands to undercut this progress. The bill's disclosure requirements may require startups to publicize sensitive business information to the public. Additionally, the testing and disclosure requirements are easier for established, well-funded companies to comply with, creating a disparate regulatory burden on Colorado's AI startups. If signed by the governor, this bill could lead to startup developers and investors to look elsewhere. We think a better approach would be to gather additional data, hear from more stakeholders, and consider new policies that targets harms. Today, I am joined by a group of AI leaders from across Colorado who believe this bill is a setback and will stifle innovation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Kinnebrew, Logan Cerkovnik, and Kyle Shannon. Hello, how are you all?
Hello.
Hello, doing well.
Hi, Kouri.
Hello. So we'll go in order. We'd love for you to introduce yourselves and talk about just briefly why you believe that this bill would stifle innovation in Colorado. Dr. Kelly Kinnebrew, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Kouri. I am an AI founder of a startup called Minerva. It's minervacoach.com, and it listens to important work conversations and helps coach you through them with techniques and dialogue skills. I legislated against this bill when it first hit our horizon, mostly because of the broadness of the definitions in the bill. I don't know how to navigate that as a startup founder. The onerousness of the reporting requirements would make potentially our business, Minerva, leave the state. We're incorporated in Colorado, a state I was born and raised in. I hope to stay incorporated here. But this doesn't do what it's hoping to do. I think the intention is good. It's let's take action because AI scares us all. Okay. But I think the unintended consequences of this are going to be negative impacts on consumers, first and foremost. And it'll allow big tech and big players who helped to craft this bill drive right through the loopholes and won't end up helping consumers. And meanwhile, tech that is, like ours is, partly created to reduce bias in decision making will not get a chance to thrive and breathe. So that's one of the reasons several of the reasons I'm against it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kinnebrew. Next, we'll go over to Mr. Logan Cerkovnik. Logan.
Hi, so I'm Logan Cerkovnik. I'm the founder and CEO of Thumper.ai. Thumper.ai is one of the few Colorado companies to release an open source foundation model this year. We released the AT1 early a couple months ago. I got involved when this bill was first introduced because we realized at that time that it was still, that it was incredibly flawed and would cause almost all AI companies to leave it then. Since then, there's been a lot of changes to it, but a lot of our core concerns, still remain. The biggest of those concerns is the definitions. Right now, the definition of generative AI would likely include a lot of common household objects, including car keys, toasters, and even your oven. And I think this really distracts from a lot of the key issues around algorithmic discrimination, and there's still too many loopholes in the bill today to advocate for it.
Thank you, Logan. And then we'll hop on over to last but definitely not least, our friend Kyle Shannon.
Thank you very much, Kouri. My name is Kyle Shannon. I'm the co-founder of the AI Salon, which is a community of about 1,500 people that are focused on exploration and application of generative AI, a bunch of AI enthusiasts. Like Governor Polis, I'm a longtime multiple entrepreneur. I co-founded agency.com, which was one of the early digital agencies in the mid 90s and many companies since then. My current company is Storyvine, right behind me here. It's a Denver-based company. We're 12 years old. This year, we rolled out a whole new suite of generative AI product extensions to our platform. Our clients are incredibly excited about it. I'm incredibly excited about it. My concern, similar to Kelly's, is that the overly broad nature of this bill and the fact that it's written in the absence of the nuances of how AI actually works, in a practical manner. And it doesn't really account for the fact that these technologies are changing literally on a weekly basis. So my fear is that it will absolutely stifle innovation for small companies like mine and everyone's here. So I appreciate the governor's consideration, and I strongly encourage vetoing this bill as it stands.
Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you so much to our listening audience today. We know you could be doing a lot of other things with your afternoon, but you came here to join us to hear what we have our thoughts on AI. And I'd love to allow the listeners to know that this is a historical moment. Just a few weeks ago, I think, not that long ago, the the Senate Judiciary Committee gathered to hear this bill, and I'd say we all made history by being the first 4 Americans to testify on against this bill together. The first question, you got right. The first question we have today, Logan, we'll have you start this one. What do you think are some of the legislative problems with SB 205?
Well, so like I previously mentioned, we have a definition of AI that that is extremely broad and isn't tailored to what most of us would consider an AI system. And so the bill requires you to disclose if a system isn't apparently an AI system or marketed as that, it's supposed to disclose that. So now, because of this bill's definition, we have all sorts of different, technologies, including household objects that are now classified as AI. And that, I think, is and we, that's a problem. We recommended some fixes to say, hey, let's limit this to, software that's been trained on a certain data set of a certain size with a certain parameter account, to say, let's just really focus on what we really believe is an AI system today. And then aside from that's, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems with the bill. I think the second kind of problem is that there's a lot of loopholes. When we started with the bill, there was like 4 exceptions to what was exempted from being a high-risk AI system. And the biggest loophole that exists today is the intermediate procedural step loophole. And what this says is that if you can argue that an AI interaction in a piece of software is an intermediate procedural step, it does not matter if it's in a high-risk industry or application. It's exempted by that. And there's still a few other loopholes that the general gist of them is if this is a decision support tool where the tool doesn't make the decision automatically, but it just says, hey, make this decision and click review to say that, this is that this is okay, that in these high risk areas or high risk of discrimination areas, that those are no longer, that's allowed. And so I think that's a kind of a horrendous loophole to have in any algorithmic discrimination legislation. And I think the genesis of a lot of these problems in the legislation come from the legislation being based off of Workday's model legislation text that they created and circulated back in the fall and maybe January to a lot of different state legislatures. And the core problem with that legislative text is that it only really imagines AI being used in an enterprise to enterprise context. It doesn't really think about, well, if an employee has generative AI tools in their Word document or Google Docs, word processor, or they can access these general purpose generative AI tools on their phone, how is that supposed to interact in this system? And so it doesn't really mesh with how the generative AI world is evolving today. And then finally, what I think the last thing I'd say is that I don't think the AG's office is the right person to be responsible for policing AI. I think we really need to have a commission of AI experts to go through and enforce AI policy. AI moves very, very fast and it's very complicated. We certainly have less complicated areas with their own technical commission sort of governing body. And I think I would hope that in the future we would create a similar thing for regulating AI.
Absolutely, Logan. I remember you being just as poignant on the day that we all testified today. Next, we'll go over to you, Kelly, Dr. Kinnebrew. You have over 30 years of experience as an organizational thought leader and as a psychologist. You are someone I'd want to listen to if I were the governor of a state before I signed a bill. What are your thoughts on some of the pitfalls legislatively of SB 205?
Well, I think first is the assumption on which it's sitting. It's a consumer protection bill, or it's intending to be that, but it also has algorithmic discrimination solidly in the middle, which is not stupid. That's smart. We're dealing with AI after all. It's making systemic decisions based on a bunch of data. But if you start from the notion of humans are better at decisions than a computer is, that's already a problem. So clean up and it is being cleaned up, regular tools that create an algorithm that informs a decision in a human-made process. Work on that, but understand that the reason we're even talking about discrimination in a bill that involves tech is because the technology itself was able to find those biases that were always there with all the decisions we've been making since the beginning of decisions. So don't punish the tool for it. Say, thank you, tool. Let's get better at tuning the tools and deal with the outcomes themselves instead of the tool creating the outcomes. I'm not saying that we don't treat AI as something distinctly different than other tools that make decisions. You need some legislation that looks at the impact of systemic use of any tool that creates widespread something. But the way that this goes about defining what that bias is and how to approach it is something I have issue with. Well, I don't think any of us would rightly make the argument that we'd like to go back to how humans made decisions because they're clearly less biased than a machine would be. We want to see the bias, do something about it, and tune those tools to make better decisions. So get to that, but do it in a smarter way than this.
Thank you. Thank you. Also, I want to let the listeners know that you now have the ability to send over questions to our distinguished panelists. They will look forward to answering some of your questions. If you want to drop those in the chat right now, we'll make sure to look through those and get to some of your questions. Dr. Kinnebrew, you mentioned discrimination. Obviously, as an African American, I know I know historically the ugly head of racism and discrimination and how it can impact our communities. I don't want to see any community discriminated against. But I know that we all have common ground and believe that a better way for us to attack discrimination with regards to AI legislation is to update the Civil Rights Code, not stifle innovation. And we know that doing this and the way that this bill is doing is not gonna work out well. Our next question, Kyle, we'll also let you answer that same question. What do you think are some of the legislative pitfalls of this bill?
Well, I think I think Logan and Kelly have covered them well. The overly broad nature of the definition of high risk AI, for me, with generative AI, you can prompt it in such a way to get it to generate, bias relatively trivially. And so what it does is anyone kind of doing anything with AI, could potentially fall into that pitfall. One of the things I mentioned before is that the nuances of how AI is used. This bill really paints AI as this incredibly broad brushstroke, like AI is a thing. And it says, you have to label an output as AI generated. And a lot of times an output may be some collaboration between a human working and AI and back and forth between the tool and the person, and you put something out there. At what point does it become AI generated? Is it when I use sentence complete in Microsoft Word? Because that's AI, right? Do I have to label that? Do I have to label every sentence within something that I produce? So there's just the nature of how the language is, exerts a burden of having to deal with these regulations where it just doesn't make sense. The other thing that seems clear to me, we've got in our state, I mean, one of the amazing things about Colorado is that we've got a well-earned reputation for being innovator friendly. And we've got a lot of people moving from New York to Colorado, from San Francisco to Colorado, coming here to innovate, right? So we've got a reputation of innovation. The governor is an entrepreneur, a multiple-time entrepreneur. And if we pass legislation that is hostile to innovation, I mean, I think we're going to lose, folks from the state who will, go to places that are more friendly to them. But I think that could absolutely stifle the inflow of innovators coming into the state, which I and personally think is one of the most exciting things going on right now. And it terrifies me that we're going to stifle that.
Thank you, Kyle. Our next question, we're going to come over to you, Kelly. But, I'd love to, a lot of folks have talked about, Connecticut. They recently was moving in this direction, but that bill didn't live, it died. Colorado would be the first state in the nation to pass such legislation if the governor were to sign it in law. But the distinction here from Connecticut and Colorado is a tech leader when we look across the states. $76 billion, over $76 billion a year in the Colorado economy is generated from the technology industry. So, Kelly, the question for you, and we'd love for the other panelists to address it as well, is how would SB 205 impact Colorado's position as a tech hub and leader in the U.S. if the governor were to sign this bill?
Well, you make the great point that this is now the first broad sweeping foundational AI bill in the country. So everybody's watching here because they're going to write, this is precedent setting. So other states are going to follow suit and use this as potentially somewhat of a model. That has a cooling effect for investment, for grant funding, for venture capital, for startups themselves to incorporate and stay here. And it's not even that. I had a question we're at Boulder Startup Week this week in Boulder, where I live and where Governor Polis lives. Hello, Governor. I hope you're coming to Boulder Startup Week. A question was asked, well, help me understand, Kelly, does this mean that we're okay if we just incorporate outside of the state? And I'll say, not really, because it gets very dicey on whether you have W-2 employees in the state, out of state, 1099s, how much activity are you doing in this state versus other states that you may have chosen to be incorporated in because of the onerous regulations now in Colorado. This becomes quite a quagmire. So what do you then have to do? You have to hire attorneys that know AI law, which is changing by the week. You have to hire agencies that mean well to help you comply under the heading of, well, we just want you to do right by consumers. Okay, sure, but now I'm paying you to help with impact analyses whenever the AG gets tickled to do that. So all this adds up to a lot of cost and money that I think all of us here are arguing actually isn't going to do the task of helping consumers make an informed choice that protects them from consequential decision making. So if I'm a startup and I'm money thinking of coming to this state, that scares me away.
Wow. Logan, what are your thoughts?
Certainly, I think that, looking at Colorado, we have a good tech, we're very proud of our tech ecosystem, but when we look at venture capital funding for AI startups, Colorado and like the Denver metro area, I believe on something that over the last year and a half has kind of fallen behind to being outside, I believe, the top 15, metro areas or tech areas in the country for AI investment. So Colorado certainly is really struggling. Colorado AI startups have not been raising nearly as successfully as their kind of coastal peers. And anything like this that kind of signals from the legislature, hey, we're kind of afraid of AI, so we're going to regulate it before we even really understand it, and doing that kind of out of fear, I think really sends the wrong message to a lot of people, whether especially investors who might say, gosh, I don't know if Colorado's a really great place for a startup to be if the legislature, isn't, taking their responsibilities of drafting reasonable regulations seriously.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Logan. Kyle, we'd love to hear your position, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I echo what both my colleagues say here. A question for me, and it goes to what you just said, Logan. Like, One of my questions is, why are we rushing this through? It feels like this is being rushed through. And I feel that AI legislation is actually quite important. It's actually really important. Um, but other than we were first in saying that we've got legislation on the books, I don't know why we're rushing it so much, and why we're not involving the community in collaborating on what legislation makes sense. And so again, I think you said the chilling effect, Logan, of sensing that they've passed legislation because they're afraid of AI. If anything, we should be excited about AI and encouraging companies to explore and innovate and see what we can do to drive innovation, and sort of living on the proactive side of it, and also collaborating with the community to put legislation forward that actually makes sense and is informed. So it's not that I don't want legislation. I just don't understand why we're rushing it. I'd like to slow it down and start having conversations to make good legislation and encourage what we want, which is more innovation in the state.
Thank you all so much. It's clear that you all believe that this bill not only threatens to stifle innovation in Colorado, but would force you all as startups. And we know that we have three of U.S. Industry leaders gathered here today, and we know there's a host of other AI leaders who share the same sentiments that we do. We're now going to pivot to questions and some sentiment from the audience, and we'll come over to you, Logan, with our first question from the audience. And someone sent us a question. I'd love to hear from you all on this one, especially. I quote, "Does the definition being narrowed to a system being a substantial factor in consequential decisions negate some of your concerns? Could you be more specific about the broadness of the definitions in the bills?" You all spoke to that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of definitions in the bill. We have an AI system definition in the bill, which is important for the consumer disclosure of what is an AI system. That is the specific thing that we're saying applies to most technology very broadly, like things in your house. Then we go to the high-risk AI system, and then we have substantial factor in consequential decisions. And I think that in the sense of we still have that first problem. When we get to the second of is it narrow enough to say substantial factor in consequential decisions? Due to the exemptions later on, I still have these concerns that anybody can put a review button on a piece of software that may be discriminatory and say, hey, it's exempted now. So I think that this whole idea, I still am not very confident around the definition of substantial factor. And I think in some of there was also, I believe, a list of exemptions that started to get very, very long for things that were exempted as substantial factors, to eventually include some language that almost sounded like an LLM itself was being exempted for that. So in general, I don't feel super confident that part of the bill is going to function the way that I think everybody wants it to.
Thank you, Logan. Dr. Kinnebrew?
Yeah, I'm nodding along with Logan, man, because yeah, that's it. It's also, the broadness comes also with any deployer using any part of the definition of AI becomes a problem. So if you walk that forward to the very end, I develop something, then I deploy it, and then somebody else deploys something, and that leads to some part of a consequential decision being impacted. What happens to me? Am I on the hook for that as the developer? What about the deployer who was trying to just do the best with the tools and the data they have in front of them? So it kind of gets back to, Kyle, what you were saying. At some point, really soon, AI is going to become the air we breathe, just like going to the internet becomes the thing you do all day long to inform decisions, build pivot tables to make decisions that are consequential, all these things. So between now and then, we have then a law that creates a lot of requirements that help to create a panacea, apparently, for consumers, so that they have some sense that they have some control over what's impacting their lives. Okay, but in that duration, I'm confident that we're going to get to, whoops, we made a mistake here, and this cost a lot of money for these startups that then ended up folding. In that time, we'll leave, other investors won't come here, and the problem isn't solved. You have a bunch of people that are on the hook for decisions that were made that can't be traced back to what parts were impacting it and what weren't. AI will become the air we breathe. So look at the decisions, look at the unfairness of something legally with, Kouri, you were bringing up, civil rights legislation. Make that more robust. Start with the existing laws we have, folks, and then look at what we need to create that's different. And that's not how this was done here. I hear from the majority leader that this bill has been crafted for the last year and a half. The entire community of technology, as well as the economic councils across Colorado, all of us who were testifying, only heard about this a month or less before this hit legislation, before the end of our session. So that says to me, we're not that interested in what you have to say. We're mostly interested in getting something out there that helps our constituents feel like we're doing something.
We're not that interested in what you have to say. We only want to make our constituents feel that we're doing something. Dr. Kinnebrew, you always say what I'm thinking. You always say what I'm thinking. Kyle, what are your thoughts? Can you be a little bit more specific about the broadness of the definitions in this bill and speak to substantial factors and consequential decisions as well?
Yeah, for me, what it comes down to is, I'm going to have to take, time and resources and probably not hire an employee or two and hire a lawyer or two to even determine if what I'm working on lives in that neighborhood. And, yesterday, OpenAI came out with a completely new model that completely changes the game. And I'm happy to geek out on it if someone wants to geek out on why it's a big deal and why it's something. If I'm spending my time as an entrepreneur trying to figure out if what the current thing I'm working on lives within a particular definition of is this regulated or not, by the time I figure that all out, the technology will have moved on. I'll be doing something else. So for me, there's just something again about this legislation is written as if AI is kind of in this, static state, and it's much more established than it is. Even though AI has been around for 4 or 5 decades, depending on your definition of it, generative AI, the thing that is touching, all of the consumers and is enabling all of our companies to do these remarkable things, has ostensibly, you could say definitionally been around since 2017 when Google invented the transformer, but really the launch of ChatGPT in November 30th, 2022 is the beginning of this era. We are in a brand new era of, primordial soup. And so having overly restrictive legislation that forces us into definitions and restricts our use of technology while this is forming is just going to be detrimental to innovation.
It is so clear that this bill is not the route forward. There is a way forward, but we know that this is not it. The next question from an audience member, we're going to go over to Kelly, then Kyle, then Logan. They note that the disclosure provisions can seem to be required, this bill, only 90 days after an incidence of bias is discovered. Kelly, can you discuss consumer protections in this bill and whether they're as robust as it's claimed? And I know that you have a lot of thoughts about it. You and I had almost an hour-long conversation about this recently.
Well, I'll first say I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to speak from the standpoint of what's legal or what's not and the right to cure, all those aspects of the bill. We'll encounter those if we unfortunately need to as Minerva, but I think the bigger part to that is how many of these can a business expect to be getting? What are the triggers for that? Somebody doesn't get hired because they opted into sharing some data from Minerva down the line, and it showed proof of skill development, but that wasn't enough for a hiring decision. And so long after that decision, I will be brought into some court proceeding because my tech was somehow touching some of those outcomes. So it's less to me the 90 days. It's more that there doesn't seem an end to how many of these situations could be brought in front of me and to be hired legal counsel to address these.
Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, again, Storyvine, we're a relatively small company. Um, having disclosure requirements that are on the scale of what Google might be required or a larger company might be required if whatever we're working on ends up falling into high risk AI. Just again, what this comes down to is if I have to either let go of employees or not hire people that can be working on innovation so that I can hire lawyers to do the disclosure on these systems, it just doesn't make sense for small business, and there's no sense of scale in this bill for how it impacts businesses that are not the big companies.
Kyle, can I just add one thing to that thought? I think uh, Senator Rodriguez said many times that, well, listen, we're just asking you to disclose when you're using this. We're just asking you to, and then fill in the blank. That just asking you to, every time those words are uttered, costs us money. It costs startup money that we don't have to address that. So on some level, I think of this as a continuum. There's, well, sort of two places to go. Well, this legislation can't hurt, right? It's better than nothing, or it does hurt. And I think we've passed over can't hurt. We've reached the does hurt part. And I don't think the legislators maybe see that now. Maybe the consumers don't see that. But it isn't just, well, it can't hurt to have more disclosures than fewer. It actually will hurt. Doesn't mean we don't need to be transparent. It means when does startup need to be transparent? What size? 50 employees is outlined in the bill as the trigger point. It makes little sense. It just does. So do something else that helps to protect startup, and that's not enough of a protection.
Thank you both. Logan, can you discuss consumer protections in this bill and whether they're as robust as folks claim them to be?
Yeah, so I think, again, aside from the loopholes that I discussed earlier, there has been, I think, a lot of conversation around, do we have, should companies have the right to fix their own AI, and how is that whole process supposed to happen? And I think the reality is that this bill is supposed to cover very important high-risk industries. And if they do have a problem with their AI model, they are now supposed to kind of work back and forth with the AG's office, who is going to have to hire some AI experts but hasn't been funded to do that. And so now we see, I think there's likely going to be kind of a conflict of, we have some really important AI models that are deployed. There may become a problem that comes up with it. How are the companies supposed to fix them? How are they supposed to work back and forth if there is a problem? And for me, for our company, we are looking at expanding into offering an LLM type product. And what we worry about with this bill is, what if somebody does misuse our LLM chat model, who we weren't expecting to use this model? Are we going to get dragged into this legislation? Is there somehow we end up being involved because somebody misused our general purpose tool in an area we never intended them to use it for? And so I think for a lot of startups, we're kind of wondering, you're kind of wondering, like, okay, there's a lot of uncertainty there. In terms of the consumers, I think there's also a lot of concern. At one point in time, I think we had the ACLU attorney kind of saying that, a previous version of this bill would be no better than, you'd be better off like suing under the other previous, anti-discrimination and like framework that exists legally, as opposed to using this new bill even. And they've made some changes since then. But I am a little concerned that there wasn't, some sort of stakeholder task force with, a bunch of civil rights and consumer protections attorneys actively engaged in drafting that initial version of the bill, because I'm not super confident that this whole system that we're creating here is really going to protect consumers. I think the first step is making sure consumers know that they've had an AI decision being made. But I think in terms of kind of like how, like the mechanics of how this is actually supposed to work out in a practical way for a high risk business to like efficiently remove discrimination and not disrupt critical services across the state, I think there's a lot missing there on how that's supposed to work.
Thank you. The next question will go to Kyle, then Logan, then Kelly. We all know that in a recent report that 18% of the state's total economic output is driven by the technology sector, and tech jobs accounted for a whopping 9% of Colorado's employment. So you would think that our Colorado leaders would be listening to you all gathered here. You represent a larger class than what you can see on this in this event today. We know that Colorado leaders generally have been listening to folks like you all, but this bill is not an example of that. We've heard about a council or a commission that they're going to set up to study the way forward. What kind of AI legislation would you like to see Colorado lawmakers work on? And does it make sense that we create a commission to study the way forward after passing a bill into law? Does it make sense? Kyle, we'll go over to you.
I don't know. I will admit to being painfully ignorant as to the ways of the world when it comes to politics and how things actually work. But what I will tell you is that you do have a community in Colorado that's very passionate about this, that is very innovative. I think to a person on this call, we're excited to contribute in any way we can, whether it's educating or brainstorming, coming up with ideas, being part of that, whether you call it a task force or working group. I think there's a lot of passion in this community to support the legislature and get the bill right. I think passing flawed legislation just to say we've passed something is dangerous, right? Because while it's easy to say, well, it doesn't kick in until 2025 and you can change things and it doesn't really have legs because it's through the AGs. There's a lot of sort of talking in circles about how we can navigate through this, with amendments after it's passed. That doesn't seem to me, and again, I might be ignorant here for the ways of the world, that doesn't seem to me the way to proceed, because laws have a funny way of sticking and turning into laws. And if we pass the wrong one and it's too restrictive, then I think it places us all at a fairly significant disadvantage. And again, I think all of our concern here is we want to stay in the state, and we don't want to prevent other people from coming into this state as an innovation hub.
Thank you. Logan, any thoughts here?
Yeah, so I think, my concern, I think there's one question that's like, what is the level, how good does a placeholder bill have to be on the books in Colorado that, and for me, I think the minimal level of that is like that it wouldn't disrupt areas outside of that bill in unintentional ways. And because this bill would disrupt, in my opinion, areas and companies outside of this, I don't think it passes that in terms of, and so I ultimately think that having a commission to study the bill is great and provide new suggestions for it. I would like to see that stakeholder committee kind of start from scratch and redraft the entire bill with kind of a more holistic perspective that kind of takes into account how people are using generative AI today and likely to use it in the future, as opposed to how we used AI maybe a couple of years ago. I would also like to see us, at some point, I think open source generative AI is really the digital infrastructure of the future. And I would like to see the legislation at some point, look at saying, hey, can we provide tax incentives for, companies that are producing this open source AI software and models? This is really valuable for us as a country, as much as our highways and roads are today. So is there a way that we can, fund that? Is there a way that we can fund, state initiatives for educational purposes? The California and the Connecticut bills both included funding for a data center for educational purposes. That was not included in this legislation. And I think the other thing that I think also kind of comes up is, we've had a lot of debates in this country around Section 230, that protects a lot of internet companies, but what are the protections that a general purpose AI company needs? Should AI companies be responsible for people misusing their products, and what are their responsibilities? And I think we really need to figure out a way to make a system that makes sense and says, hey, you're an AI company, you have a general purpose piece of software, you're only liable for X, Y, and Z. And if people misuse your software, there's another way that we address that without banning the generally useful, wide applicable software that's released today.
Thank you, Logan. And then finally, we'll have Kelly address this question as well. And I have to remind the audience that Dr. Kelly Kinnebrew she has over 30 years of organizational leadership. This is an organizational question. Does it make sense to you for us to establish a commission after rushing a bill forward? What are your thoughts here?
Everything that I've been told by people that know more about task forces than I do will say that's only going to be marginally effective. Because I've asked a lot of people, help me understand this task force idea. It's better than nothing, but is it? Because we're taking a bill that's already an act, if Polis doesn't veto it, and now we're going to tweak. We keep being told we'll tweak it, don't worry. Well, no, I don't know how that changes something that's already bad from its core. It just means we're going to have to, as startups, figure out some workarounds until we either exit this state or figure out some other solutions. I want to tack on to something that Logan said. The lack of an educational component to this bill is bad. I think a solid way forward, if you were to craft legislation from the ground up, would be to look at how we are integrating technology as a whole. And if it's not AI, it's going to be quantum next. It's going to be whatever the next thing is. What are we going to do? A quantum bill now? Everything that uses quantum? I mean, this is sort of gets to be endless. And that's where we go back to start with current legislation. And then if you're doing something with AI, maybe a great way forward is user-controlled settings where you offer users more control over how they receive the information about AI. That could be a solution. Which 7 things should be a part of a bill? Is a commission going to create that? No, because the bill's already an act. So to create something that really has teeth and also encourages startup requires a ground-up approach. Once this moves forward, that it is you can't. Enough tweaks aren't going to fix something that's already flawed to begin with.
Thank you. We actually do have I'm a little ahead of schedule. We do have one more, we have time for another audience question, and we have one right here, which I think is good because we've been talking a lot about discrimination, and then Kyle, we'll start with you, then Logan, then Dr. Kinnebrew. This question is, those who study AI discrimination say we already are behind in oversight of the risk. Most major companies already use AI in hiring, for example, affecting millions of Americans. Given that, what would you say to reassure Coloradans whose lives may be influenced, sometimes without their knowledge, by this potentially biased technology? Kyle.
Yeah, I think, and I think that Dr. Kinnebrew has deep thoughts on this. But I think that legislation to protect consumers is not only appropriate, I think it's required. I don't think anyone here is saying that we don't want to address bias. I think it's critical that we address it. It's just that the mechanism of this bill is coming at it in a sort of ham-fisted way that is just swinging this broad sword through anyone that might in any way possibly touch a decision-making process. And it, rather than being surgical, it's just kind of I don't know, blasting through anyone using it in such a broad way that I don't think it actually addresses the issue, right? There's, as Logan talked about a couple of times, some of the loopholes are big enough that you can just drive a truck through it, and that is counter to what the goal is. So I think all of us here are absolutely for legislation to protect consumers. It's just that this bill has a good title, but bad contents.
Absolutely. Logan, any thoughts there?
I think being a placeholder bill, the bill would not go into effect for several years. And so by vetoing the bill today, it gives us a chance to restart with this task force that includes consumer protection advocates and civil rights advocates, and make sure that they're at the, that they have a slot at the table from the drafting process, not merely given a chance to redline a bill that's already been drafted that's, fairly far along its way. And so I think that, I think we have to make sure that everybody, can feel confident and restore confidence in consumers that they will not be unfairly discriminated against. And and so I think that I think there's more work to be done. I don't think that this is necessarily something like, nobody here is saying don't regulate algorithmic discrimination. What everybody is saying is that this is a very challenging topic, and it's very important to get it right for everyone. And I think one of my biggest concerns is today, kind of, based off the civil rights legislation that's in place today, all discrimination is bad, no matter how it's done, whether it's through a computer, but now we're kind of saying, if AI does it, there might be some exceptions, or AI discrimination is different from all discrimination. And that creates the risk that we might create a gap that would allow more discrimination in the first place. And so before we go down that road, we need to be very, very careful that what we're doing makes sense and is going to work the way that we all want it to.
Thank you, Logan. Dr. Kinnebrew.
Well, I couldn't have encapsulated it better, Logan. Thank you, my friend. Yeah, I'll just add this one thing. Organizations are losing in court already with the position of, well, the AI did it. So AI take the wheel isn't a defense. They're losing with these unfair decisions. At some point, though, we will get to, so this is going to play the other side of this, we will get to a point where we're not sure, we're already there, how AIs made the decisions that they made. So we may need an AI to explain the decisions that other AIs made. That creates a series of philosophical and practical conversations around bias, and that's worthy to have those conversations. But approaching the conversation of bias from, we've never seen this before, let's put laws in place, instead of, oh, we've seen this before, this is already happening, protected classes aren't protected in the following ways, and that's why we have legislation that helps bring these to the courts and have them win, is the place to go. It doesn't create something from net new. And this is the concern when you have something like discrimination in the way it's defined in this bill, with the language that it has. It just needs to be looked at. And to Logan's good point, this isn't scheduled to become enacted until 2026. So if you get off the position of, we need to have a soundbite for the country that says we're first, if you're able to put ego to one side about this and realize that you don't want to be a part of a bad bill that you're going to be embarrassed about later, you say, we need to start from the ground up, just like Connecticut apparently has, and say, whoopsie, sorry, meant to do right, let's do this right, and this is not the right way. It also, to Kyle's good point, gives us a little bit more runtime to see what AI is going to do. This is a moving target, folks. So if that's the concern, rest on the current legislation to help, and it is already being tapped, to address wrongs in society with decisions being made. That's what you do. You don't go to the tool and say, well, this is wholesale a problematic set of tools, so let's just ban these. Who does that help? Well, it helps big tech, certainly. It helps Workday, who has helped to craft this legislation, probably. It does not help small startups, many of whom are trying to fix those bias problems to begin with.
Thank you, Kelly. And, we're going to get to our last question. And you've all heard me talk about this, and I have to reiterate, as an African-American, especially someone who has fought against discrimination for the majority of my entire career, working with groups like the NAACP, Urban League, National Action Network. At the Chamber of Progress, we agree that discrimination is wrong, but focusing exclusively on AI systems ignores offline discrimination, as Logan so eloquently pointed out. Pinpointing the source and catalyst of discriminatory outcomes of an AI system is not always possible, nor is it consistently determining who or what is responsible for that act of discrimination. So, Mr. Governor, we hope you're listening to us as we talk about this today. And With that being said, our final question is going to be, what is your message to the governor, Governor Polis? And we'll go right back to you, Kelly.
I would say, Governor Polis, you're an inventor like us. You come from technology. I think you probably see a lot of flaws already in this bill. So have some courage, please. Take a stand that everybody will remember you for, with saying, this isn't the right bill. Consumers, this is why we need to go back to the drawing board and get the right parties involved. Have the courage to do what the right way to do a bill like this, which is so consequential, is. There's a right path. This is not that path. And I think he knows that.
Thank you so much, Logan.
You know, I think any bill that defines your car keys, toaster, or oven as AI is half-baked and needs to go back to the legislature for another session. If states can't pass competent AI legislation, we're going to create an opportunity for federal lobbyists to say, you know what, states can't be trusted to create AI legislation on their own. They don't know what they're doing. And that's going to undermine everybody who wants states to be able to create strong and powerful anti-discrimination, AI discrimination laws. You know, so I think everybody wants there to be better laws. I think the issue with this is that I don't think it serves Colorado, and I think it may actually help embolden some of the lobbyists at the federal level who would say, look, you try to use this as an example to say, hey, you know, this is why we need our federal AI laws to preempt state laws, because state lawmakers, you know, can't do this well enough. And so we hope that by vetoing this bill, we could say, hey, here's another chance for the Colorado legislature to take another whack at it, you know, the next legislation, and it's going to take a long time. It's not an easy bill, it's a complicated bill, but it's very important, and it's important to keep making progress to improve this till it's at a state where we all feel comfortable with it.
Thank you, Logan. We'll go over to Kyle. Anyone who is familiar with Kyle and lives in this country that's familiar with his work knows that he is an expert storyteller. We all see the guitar well placed right behind you. Help us capture this story, Kyle. What would your message be to the governor?
That's it. Governor Polis, I will spare you singing. Here's what I would say. You're an entrepreneur. You're an innovator. You know, at your heart, support small businesses, support innovators, support entrepreneurs. Don't pass legislation that has, sort of the broad sweeping effect of stifling that innovation. You've also got a community of people ready, willing, and able to participate in this process. I think, as Logan put it, let's veto this bill, veto 24-205, and let's start from scratch and get it right and do it in a way that supports innovation in the state. And let's keep it friendly for companies like Storyvine and everyone who's on this panel.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Governor Polis, Colorado's tech industry generates more than $76 billion a year in gross state product, accounting for 18% of the state's total economic output and 9% of Colorado's employment. As you've heard from Logan, Kyle, and Dr. Kelly Kinnebrew today, this bill is not the way forward. Mr. Governor, Colorado has always listened to its tech industry leaders, but this bill is not an example of leaders listening. This bill is an example of not listening to the voices that we see gathered here today. We all agree on a few things. There is a way forward, but this bill is not it. Mr. Governor, we urge you to veto SB 205. Thank you, and thank you to all of you who've joined us here today, and have a wonderful afternoon.